Welcome to the latest international workshop of the University of Tokyo's Science, Technology and Innovation Governance Program, or STIG, titled New Space in Asia, Implications of the Rise of the Chinese Commercial Space Sector in Asia and Beyond. My name is Quentin Verspieren. I am a researcher at the STIG program and an associate research fellow at the European Space Policy Institute, which is co-hosting this event. In recent years, the Asia-Pacific region has witnessed the emergence of a vibrant commercial space industrial ecosystem. Based on the complex interactions of a variety of stakeholders, the Asian space sector has undergone deep transformations. While these mutations, characteristic of what we call new space, have been extensively analyzed in the United States and Europe, research on Asia remained fragmented until the publication by the European Space Policy Institute of its latest report titled New Space in Asia, Expert Views on Space Policy and Business Trends in Asian Countries, which was published in January 2021 and which is available for free on the website of the European Space Policy Institute. So building on this pioneering research and thanks to an exceptional lineup of prominent experts, today's workshop proposes a detailed overview of Asia's new space with a specific focus on one of its key players, the People's Republic of China. It will be composed of 2 keynotes followed by a panel discussion. Now I would like to invite Professor Hideaki Shiroyama to deliver the opening remarks. Professor Shiroyama is Professor of Public Administration at the Graduate School of Public Policy and at the Graduate Schools for Law and Politics at the University of Tokyo. In addition, he is the director of the STIG program. Professor Shiroyama, you may have the floor.
Yes, thank you, Quentin, and thank you all the participants for participating in this online event. As Quentin explained, the STIG is the Science, Technology and Innovation program. It's a kind of the interdisciplinary and the interdepartmental program focusing on the interface between the science, technology, and public policy. One of the activity we are doing is providing the kind of the interdisciplinary certificate program for the master level student and doctoral level student at the University of Tokyo to deal with the issue between the science, technology, and public policy. Actually, we have been doing the working in various areas, including the risk governance issue relating to nuclear safety and food safety and governance of the AI or the digitalization. But one of the areas we have been recently focusing on is the space issue. We have Quentin and we have Professor Suzuki recently joined in our school and who are working heavily relating to the space policy, especially international political context. Today, we are very fortunate that we have panelists from around the world focusing on the issue of the new space in Asia, especially the implication of the Chinese new space. I think this might be a very timely topic and will stimulate the discussion among us. And hopefully, we are thinking that we also think about the next step for following this event. Anyway, thank you very much for participating in this panel, and we are looking forward to a very lively discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Shiroyama, for these opening remarks. So now the first keynote, providing an overview of new space in Asia, will be delivered by Mr. Marco Aliberti. Marco is a senior research fellow at the European Space Policy Institute in Vienna, Austria, where he has carried out and published a number of research projects in the areas of access to space and human spaceflight, governance and international relations of space, and Asia's space programs, particularly those of China, Japan, and India. Before handing over to you, Marco, let me explain that you can submit questions in the Q&A box in English or Japanese at any time. The questions will be collected and asked to the speakers and panelists during the panel discussion only, not after each keynote. The chat box is not intended to be used for questions, but it will remain open for comments, for networking, You can share your identity, your contact information if you want to connect with panelists and other participants. Now, Marco, you have the floor.
Thank you, Quentin. Hello, minasan. What a great pleasure to be with you today. And first of all, let me thank the University of Tokyo for hosting this workshop on this exceedingly relevant topic. 本当にありがとうございます。What I would like to do in this keynote is to provide you with an overview of the outcome of this new public report addressing new space dynamics in the Asian region that we just released at ESPI. For those who do not know ESPI, ESPI is a public European think tank based in Vienna dealing with space policy matters. Our mission is to provide decision makers, European decision makers, with informed views on mid to long-term issues relevant to Europe's space activities. In this context, we act as an independent platform for developing policy options and forward-looking strategies on how to maximize Europe's engagement in space. We do this through a variety of activities that spans from public reports, books, position papers, to workshop, conference, and dedicated support services to our members. You see here on the right our membership list, which is quite plethoric and spans from European institution to National Space Agency and private industry. As per our research focus, we do cover most issues areas from industrial policy matters to socioeconomic studies, and from safety and security topics to international relations and governance issues. Now, as part of the research areas that we have been covering, since 2015, we have been looking into the so-called new space. As you know, there has been a lot of media hype and even speculation about the recent rise of private space activities, to an extent that we question whether this rise may in fact be another wave cresting rather than an actual trend, especially considering factors such as the uncertain market demand evolutions, the risk of oversupply, the continued dependence of most business on institutional support, as well as the abundance of past speculative assessment based on potential rather than actual markets. Be this as it may, in our research, we found out that whereas the vast majority of space activities today is still led by governments, with private actors acting as suppliers and relying massively on public funding, a new, potentially disruptive and commercially driven approach to space is indeed taking root. Although no broadly accepted definition of new space exists today, we can intend it as a new sectorial dynamic encompassing a wide range of diverse and interrelated trends that are leading the space sector towards a more business and service-oriented approach. These trends you see here include, first of all, new entrants, including new business ventures from space companies, startups, but also non-space companies seeking to enter the sectors, new solutions, including new products, new services, but also groundbreaking proposition features such as integrated solutions, lower costs, higher flexibilities. We have new markets in both the upstream and downstream segment of the value chains, for instance, in orbit services, micro launchers, satellite broadband, new industrial setup, including new methods for the production of space systems, new private investment tools from a variety of sources, including, for instance, venture capital, private equity, loans, grants, and even crowdfunding, and new public schemes through which the public actors, National Space Agency, interact with commercial companies or private companies, as well as new tools for, procurement rather than support to innovation. Now, as part of our research activities addressing new space, we found out that some important questions had not been properly examined. We in particular found that whereas a lot of attention has been paid to the new space dynamics emanating from the West, in particular the dynamic Silicon Valley entrepreneurship, trends in other regions have been overlooked. However, a more careful examination of global industrial and innovation dynamics would tell us to look at Asia. And many, of course, the rationale to do so, and hence to prepare this report. First of all, it is clear to everyone that the geoeconomic and geopolitical body centers are moving to the Asia-Pacific region, along with a well-known maxim of the Asian century. And it's enough here maybe to recall the economic growth and demographic dividend of most Asian countries to realize this inherent importance. It is likewise clear that commercial dynamics in the Asia-Pacific context are bound to generate far-reaching implications on Europe, and it's hence important to, first of all, understand what is going on, to then assess the extent impact. And this is one, in fact, objectives of today's workshop. Third, apart from the impact, there may be lessons, I would say, that could be learned from new space dynamics in Asia. For instance, in Europe, we always tend to look at the US, but from an industrial perspective, we may find more similarities with the Japanese industrial structures in terms, for instance, of the more limited institutional demand, especially for military space activities, that prevents both countries, both regions, basically, to create scale economies. And finally, because of what I just mentioned, we had just piecemeal, fragmented information on what is going on in the region. For instance, we have interesting data on investment, thanks to the work done by Blaine or our friends at the Space-Tide Foundation, but we were missing a comprehensive, holistic picture of what is going on also in terms, for instance, of governmental support structures, which are equally important. Now, for all this reason, and with the overarching objective of providing a sound analysis of new space dynamics in selected Asian countries, we decided to investigate the issues with the support of local experts, providing us insights on commercial space sectors and new space ecosystems, analysis of public strategies and measures to support the growth of commercial space, as well as perspectives on major trends and prospects for growth. Now, the report, as you see here, covers 6 Asian countries: Japan, China, India, South Korea, Malaysia, Thailand. For the big 3, I would say, Asian powers, we have a double contribution. The first one focusing on commercial space ecosystem and its trends, and the second one focusing on public policies and measures to support commercial space. For the other 3 countries, South Korea, Malaysia, and Thailand, we have a single contribution covering both aspects. The contributors are expert based in these countries, basically, with the most diverse professional profiles. And I would like actually to take this occasion to thank all authors once more for their excellent contributions. Now, without spending too much time on the content of individual chapters, since we have a dedicated presentation by one of the authors, what I would like to do is to provide you with a few takeaways that emerge from the report. Now, the first and most obvious take is that dynamics unfolding in the region should not be treated as one generic, since there are visible differences among the various national ecosystems, especially if we consider a difference in the broader political, industrial, and economic settings. With that being said, and in line to what we see in the US and Europe, we can say that a fertile commercial ecosystem has progressively emerged in all analyzed countries, thanks to a combination of actions taken by both private and public stakeholders. Now, space business in the region have quickly grown in both number and size, although here with varying degree of maturity, I would say. Japan and China in particular have fully entered the new space age, with both countries witnessing the emergence of commercially competitive companies in most industry segments. Apart from maybe these new businesses, what is also interesting is that the space industry of China and India and Japan in particular have also witnessed growth and diversification of the investors' profile, again here with national specificities. And equally interesting point is that there seems to be growing public awareness about the importance of governmental role in stimulating the emergence of a commercially competitive space industry. And the various contributions in the report, in fact, show a diversity of measures put in place by the various Asian governments to stimulate commercial space. What is interesting, especially from a European perspective, is that some of these public measures may also provide an interesting case study for Europe. Now, although I would say the consolidation of these new space dynamics is proceeding at a fairly rapid speed, it is undeniable that when compared to Europe and the US in particular, the overall enterprise readiness level remains lower. A number of factors can be identified to explain this more limited, I would say, emergence of new space, especially among emerging space Asian nations. First of all, the involvement and capabilities of private industry in the national space programs continue to be more limited as compared to Europe and the US. This is true for both big powers such as China and Japan, as well as emerging space nations such as Thailand and Malaysia. The reason is the fact that in both the upstream and downstream, the role of public actors continue to be predominant, with national space agencies such as ISRO or CARI and state-owned enterprise such as CASC acting as the main manufacturer and provider of space capabilities, basically. Second, the private investment base to support startups remain relatively smaller. With the exception of China, the figures that we have are still far from the multi-billion figures reported in the US in particular. And third, the level of public sponsorship, which has been key in the success of new space companies in the US, has so far been more limited. Most Asian countries, including India and China, are yet to adopt transparent and comprehensive regulatory systems that are supportive of private space activities that ensure predictability and responsiveness of the ecosystem, I would say. But alongside with these obstacles, we also see an inherent growth potential, and we should mention at least three macro factors underpinning, a growth trajectory for new space companies in Asia. First of all, conditions on the demand side proved to be particularly promising, given their size and scale. Most Asian countries are already huge markets, and these projections seems to further growth in the future. Second, there are equally important valuable assets and talent on the supply side. All analyzed countries basically have strong innovation skill, robust R&D expertise, academic and scientific excellences, but also a strong manufacturing sectors and ICT service backbone. And third, I would mention that Asian SMEs and startups in most countries see growing possibilities to leverage positive externalities that can help this national ecosystem, and more specifically this company, to move towards long-term growth. These include, for instance, the prospects to attract FDI, acquisitions, but also joint ventures. And similarly, on a similar note, the level of public sponsorship, which, as we said, is key, is expected to grow further in the coming years, so helping to turn the solution proposed by Asian entrepreneurs into viable business case. Now, with this being said, we can expect that new space companies in most Asian countries hold the potential not only to disrupt in the future the way space activities will be conducted in their home countries, but also to exercise a significant influence on the global space economy. And with this, I maybe give the floor back to the moderator so that we can go into the specifics of one of the case studies we analyzed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marco, for this really wonderful expose that you made of the new space landscape in the regions. And in particular, your two last slides on the key takeaways that you shared were, I think, really valuable. And I encourage everyone in the audience to read the SP report to go further and get all the detailed analysis that Marco made in this report. And I encourage you, if you have further questions for Marco, to submit these questions in the Q&A box, again, in English or Japanese, both are fine. Now, let us zoom in, and from this Asian perspective, look at the specific case of China, thanks to our exceptional speaker, Mr. Blaine Curcio. Blaine is a consultant and analyst specializing in the space and aerospace industries, particularly in regard to China. And he's the founder of Hong Kong-based Orbital Gateway Consulting and is affiliate senior consultant for Euroconsult. Blaine is a contributor to Go Taikonotes, as well as the co-founder of the Dongfang Hour, a podcast focused on the Chinese space and aerospace industries, which is a podcast on YouTube that I particularly enjoy. So Blaine, now you have the floor. If the slides can be.
Yes, I'm just going to share my screen now, and thank you very much for the kind introduction and also the kind words. And please let me know when you can see my slides.
We can see your slides. You can start presenting.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation. It's really an honor to be speaking at this STIG workshop. As Quentin mentioned, my name is Blaine Curcio, and I will be talking today about new space in China. Just one very small point I will mention before I start is that I may use the phrase new space and commercial space somewhat interchangeably, and I will explain a little bit more why that is on slide number 4 or possibly slide number 5. So just to give a very brief overview of what I will talk about today, I will first give an overview of the Chinese space sector before zooming in on the commercial space industry in China. I will then look at some of the leading commercial space sectors within the commercial space industry and where the funding is coming from for those sectors, before talking about some of the important policies and mechanisms that impact the Chinese commercial space sector, looking at some industry structural considerations, and then we'll provide some conclusions. And I will try to do all of this within about 12 to 14 minutes. So I understand that we're here to talk about new space and commercial space in China, but first I think it is important to understand how the new space part of the industry fits into the broader Chinese space sector. And so when looking at the broader Chinese space sector and how it impacts commercial space companies, there are 3 important things to consider on this slide. So the first one is that while new space is growing very quickly in China, the overwhelming majority of space industry activity in China is still state-owned companies. So the largest one is the China Aerospace Science and Technology Corporation, CASC, and there are a few others, notably CASIC and CETC. So that is the first point, is that new space is growing very quickly, but it is still very much dominated by state-owned enterprises. The second point I would mention is that the CNSA plays a much more administrative role in China than does, for example, NASA in the United States. So the CNSA, the China National Space Administration, is, as the name implies, the National Space Administration of China. However, when comparing it to, say, NASA, in the US, NASA actively tries to give contracts to commercial companies. NASA has very large projects that they are awarding contracts for. They have a lot of power, and they have a lot of power relative to the big industrial companies in the US. And in China, the CNSA is not such an organization. It is more of a kind of international collaboration type of organization that does not really have very much contract awarding power. And to Marco's earlier point about the continued reliance on institutional support of the space industry, in China, there is certainly a lot of state support, but the institutional support at kind of a space program level is really not there, because again, the CNSA, they only would award contracts to CASC if they award contracts at all. And then CASC does not really like to award contracts to commercial space companies. So this really, it cuts off China's commercial space companies from one source of funding that would usually be present in, let's say, the US or even in the European Union or possibly Japan. So again, that's the second point, is that the CNSA in China is not nearly as, say, powerful in ability to develop the new space sector as it is in some Western countries. The last point that I would bring up is that one of the entities that is quite powerful in helping the commercial space, the new space economy in China, are the provincial governments. And so China, there's a couple of things I would note here. So as you probably know, there are many provinces in China that are very huge. You know, Guangdong has as many people as Japan almost. I think it's about 115 million people. And so they're very large, and they have very large governments in these provinces, which means that the provinces have a lot of money relative to, say, states in the US. And so what we have seen over the last several years is most of the largest and most successful new space companies in China have partnered with a provincial or a city government in some way. And that could include, you know, some free land or, you know, a subsidized factory or this type of thing. But essentially we have provinces and also cities to some extent as a very significant supporting actor in the Chinese space sector. So now zooming in a little bit more on new space, or again, commercial space in China. So to my earlier point, the phrase new space in China is not so common. Commercial space of Shangye Hangtian is much more commonly used. And within commercial space, this is not really a black and white thing. There are several different types of companies within the commercial space definition. And I mean, I would generally divide this into 4 different types of companies, as we see here. So the first type would be commercial subsidiaries of a state-owned enterprise or of the Chinese Academy of Science. So this would include companies like X-Space, which is a commercial launch subsidiary of KEYSIC, and it is essentially fully owned by KEYSIC. The second type is a commercial spin-off of the SOE or of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. So this would be a company that is not fully owned by the state-owned enterprise. They have less direct support, but they still probably have inherited a lot of technological know-how and also probably some funding, and probably can expect that if they do, say, develop some new technology, they might be able to sell that technology back to their sort of parent company, state-owned enterprise, let's say. The third type is, you know, privately founded startups. So this would be companies that are usually founded by a team from the traditional space sector, so usually CASC or some CASC subsidiary, and they are generally private. They are usually mostly funded with commercial venture capitalist money, although there's also usually some provincial funding or other kind of government support there. But a couple of these would be like Minospace and Galaxy Space are these privately founded startups. And the fourth type would be listed companies, so companies that are traded on the stock exchange. So this would include PiSat, which is an Earth observation sort of downstream services company. And one last point is that there are some companies that would be in more than one category. So for example, CGSTL, which is a Chinese Academy of Sciences spinoff focused on Earth observation satellites. They are a type 2 company. However, they are probably going to IPO in the next year, and that would make them also a type 4 company. And just one last point on this slide I would mention is that each of these different types of companies tend to have some advantages and some disadvantages. And so just to take one example, if we look at a company like X-Space, which again is a wholly owned commercial subsidiary of KEYSIC, they get a lot of financial support from KEYSIC. So they raised 1.2 billion RMB at the end of 2017, mostly from KEYSIC. They get some technological support. So they have these benefits, but then at the same time, they do also have this ability to be a little bit more nimble and a little bit more creative than a purely state-owned company. So for example, with X-Space, it was quite famous last year. They did an online auction of their rocket, which was a live auction. It got about 300 million views on the Chinese internet, and the rocket sold for $5 million US. And you could never imagine, CASC or China Great Wall doing this. It's too outside the box. It's too creative. But at the same time, X-Space may have a disadvantage of being still not quite as independent as one of the kind of more privately funded companies. So again, you have many different kind of shades of what we could call commercial space in China, and each one has a little bit of a different way that it interacts with the government and with private investors, and with the industry more broadly. So now looking at some of the leading commercial space sectors in China, and we will first look at funding by sector, and then the next slide we will look at where does that funding come from. And so as we see here, funding for Chinese commercial space has increased significantly in the last just 6 years. So as recently as 2014, funding was 16 million RMB, and in 2020 it was more than 7 billion RMB, so a little more than $1 billion US. What we've seen consistently is that launch is the leading vertical, and China now has 5 commercial launch companies that have raised more than $150 million, and they have probably 20 commercial launch companies in total. And I would also point out that, just to take launch as an example, there are so many companies that there are now a handful of subsystems level launch companies. So you will have companies that are focused on developing a specific liquid methalox engine for rockets, and they will partner with a different commercial company that is building the whole rocket, and they will just sell that one piece of technology. So again, launch is the largest sector in terms of the amount of funding, probably also in terms of the number of companies, although that depends on how you define satellite manufacturing. But digressing, launch is the largest commercial sector right now. Earth observation and Satcom are 2 that have also been consistently seeing growth in funding. And these are both being supported by higher level government policies that we will talk about a little bit more in a couple of slides. Satellite manufacturing, likewise, has seen a large increase over the last couple of years. This also in line with government policy, most notably the addition by the National Development and Reform Commission of satellite internet to their list of new infrastructures. So after this addition, we saw a large increase in investment into satellite manufacturing. The last takeaway that I would point out before going into the sources of funding is that over the last several years, we have seen the amount of money raised every year increase, but we have started to see the number of funding rounds decrease. And so the number of funding rounds peaked in 2018 at about 60 or 70 funding rounds. And that has now come down to about 35 or 40 in 2020. And what that tells us is that we are having much larger funding rounds on average. And what has happened also is that there is some consolidation of resources. So you have a few companies that are raising very large amounts of money, and then a large number of companies that are having trouble raising such large amounts of money, we could say. And so who are they raising this money from is a question that I would like to discuss a little bit. As I mentioned earlier, there are a few different actors that are interacting with Chinese commercial space companies. So this would mostly be the central government, the local government, or private investment. And as we see on the chart, earlier on, 2015, 2016, 2017, a lot of the funding was coming from central government or provincial government. And over the last 3 years, we've seen a lot more private investment as a percentage of the whole, and also just a lot more private investment. And part of this has been these much larger funding rounds. We've seen some very big funding rounds that have been all one private investor. So for example, at the end of 2019, Landspace raised 500 million RMB from Country Garden Real Estate, which is a large real estate conglomerate based in Shenzhen. And what we see is that there is this alignment of incentives between the private sector and the provincial government and the national level strategy and priorities. So you would have, for example, a provincial or a city government that wants to bring high-tech, high-quality development jobs to their city or their province, and space, of course, is one such area. And you have private investors that see that the government is supporting the space sector, and so for them, in China, one of the one of the most certain ways to increase private investment is to have the government say we want to do this thing. And so you see private sector investment has increased a lot. And I would point out again that most of the leading space sectors, they have in some way followed some government policy. And so just to give a couple of examples of the sort of variety of funding sources for these companies, we see in this table, again, land space, mostly private funding, but they have also received some land from the government of Huzhou in Zhejiang province to build a satellite factory. Similarly, CGSTL, they are a spin-off of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. They have received some support from the government of Changchun City in Jilin province. And as part of the province's sort of aerospace industrial base, they are building the largest Earth observation factory in Asia, Earth observation satellite manufacturing facility in Asia. So these are the different sources of funding, and again, just some of the different interactions between these sources of funding. And so now to look at some of the policies and mechanisms that are really driving this funding. As I said, one of the most certain ways to see funding increase is to make it a government policy in China. I would like to highlight three in particular. So I presume that many of you have heard of the Belt and Road Initiative, and within the Belt and Road Initiative, there is a specific space initiative called the Spatial Information Corridor. And this essentially comprises Beidou satellite, the satellite navigation constellation, Earth observation satellites, communication satellites, and the idea is to build the space infrastructure, which is primarily finished now. I mean, Beidou is in orbit in service, and many of the Earth observation constellations, and then to export the services across the Belt and Road region. And so we see that this is a major initiative, both at a national level and in sort of motivating the actions of commercial companies. The second policy I would like to discuss briefly is the, again, new infrastructures, which I mentioned before, but basically this list of infrastructures that the government and that the NDRC has published. And these are digital infrastructures that they would like to develop over the next several years. And we have seen large tech companies such as Tencent make very, very large promises for investing into new infrastructure. So in the case of Tencent, they mentioned investing 500 billion RMB. So yeah, 500 billion RMB into new infrastructure. And as I mentioned before, last year, the government added satellite internet to this list of new infrastructures. And this has seen a large increase in funding for satellite internet thereafter. The last policy I would like to talk about briefly is the space-sky integration. So this is essentially the idea of linking communications in space with those on the ground. So just a quick last slide here on industry structure considerations, because I realize I'm running out of time. So there's three things that I would like to highlight. The first, I do not think there can be a Chinese version of Elon Musk. And what I mean is, in the US, Elon Musk, when he started SpaceX, essentially said NASA builds rockets that are quite reliable, but quite expensive, and SpaceX can build a better rocket for less money. And he did do that. And in the US, because it's a capitalist society, people applaud this and they say that that's good, it's innovative. And in China, it is impossible to imagine an entrepreneur saying that the government is not making good enough rockets. It could never happen. The second point, China wants more international cooperation, but they also want to build more things at home. And this is an important kind of contradiction, because it makes it less clear how foreign companies can cooperate, because China does not really like buying things from outside if they can avoid it. The last point I would bring up is this difficulty of aligning incentives. And this is largely the case because you have these very big state-owned companies. And the example I would give is the low Earth orbit broadband constellation. And so with the low Earth orbit broadband constellation, you have essentially a telecommunications network in space. And if you look at Starlink, they're just vertically integrating. They're going to try to sell it directly, and that's fine. But in China, if you imagine, you have CASC, the big space company, and then you have the three large Chinese telecommunication companies. You have China Telecom, China Mobile, China Unicom. And if you want to have a broadband constellation, this would basically need to coordinate these two types of companies. And they both have their monopolies in their industries. And there's not a lot of incentive for them to cooperate here. I mean, China Telecom has 300 million or 500 million mobile subscribers terrestrially, their business is not going to be significantly impacted if they get some revenues from a LEO broadband constellation. It's a big risk and it's not such a reward. And similarly with CASP, you know, they have all these space programs. They're doing the Mars missions and the moon missions, all these things. And to try to become a telco from the sky is just not so straightforward. So those are the last, well, I have a couple of concluding points, but I will skip them for later, or I'll leave the PowerPoint online because I do believe I'm out of time here. But thank you very much for your kind attention. And by all means, if you'd like to find me on LinkedIn, you can find me at hashtag China Space Guy, or as Quentin mentioned, you can check out my podcast. So thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thanks a lot, Blaine, for this truly great presentation. In particular, for a non-expert of China like me, the Chinese space sector could be fairly obscure with the numerous governmental or government-owned corporation like CAS, CASIC, CAS, CNSA that you mentioned. So thanks for providing some clarity in all this. And I particularly like your taxonomy of 4 types of companies that I think is very useful, a very useful framework to understand how the Chinese commercial space sector works. And obviously, the wealth of data that you presented is quite impressive, and quite amazed at how much data you could collect on the investment and the type of companies. Again, to our dear audience, do check the contribution of Blaine and his co-authors in the SP report for more details. Now, after the 2 keynotes, let us move to the panel discussion to investigate with our great panelists the implications of the rise of the Chinese new space on Asia and on the world. For this, Marco and Blaine will be joined by 2 prominent experts. Firstly, Dr. Rajeswari Raji Pillai Rajagopalan, Distinguished Fellow and Head of the Nuclear and Space Policy Initiative at the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi, India. Raji, one of Asia's leading space security experts, was also technical advisor to the United Nations Group of Governmental Experts, GGE, on prevention of arms race in outer space, PAROS, in 2018 and 19. And finally, among many other responsibilities, she's a senior Asia defense writer for The Diplomat, writing a weekly column on Asian strategic issues that you should definitely follow. Secondly, Professor Kazuto Suzuki, who is Professor of Science and Technology Policy at the Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Tokyo, Japan. He has worked in the Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique in Paris as assistant researcher and associate professor at the University of Tsukuba from 2000 to 2008, and then professor of international politics at Hokkaido University until 2020. He also served as an expert in the panel of experts for Iranian Sanction Committee under the United Nations Security Council from 2013 to July 2015. Now, I would like to start with you, Raji. Considering the existing tensions, I would say, and competition that exists between China and India, could you give us an overview of the reactions to and the implications of the growth of the Chinese commercial space sector that Blaine wonderfully presented from an Indian perspective?
Thank you, Quentin, and thank you for your very kind introduction. It's great to be part of this panel here, and among friends and long-term colleagues in a sense. China's new space sector, the commercial sector, is a fairly impressive one. There is a tremendous development out there. And because when you look at it primarily, the private sector participation, the commercial enterprises, they were all typically part of the Western exercise. And they were seen as a Western phenomena. Asia wasn't particularly excited about having its own private sector. Whether you take the case of the major spacefaring powers, Japan, China, India, all of them, their space programs are primarily state-led in a sense. So to have a flourishing industry or a private sector come up in a big way, I think that's is fairly new. It's a fairly recent phenomena in a sense. So this is a big change that I'm seeing in Asia now. Within Asia, of course, I think the Japan has been fairly somewhat more active than India and China. But I think there are a couple of different aspects that come into play. One is, of course, the free market principle that is gaining greater currency, and I think that's kind of pushing to integrate or involve the private sector as a key partner in this space growth story in a sense. But this could also be a result of capacity issues. And for India, I can say that this is primarily because of the capacity deficit issues within the ISRO, the Indian Space Research Organization, that India is opening out to the private sector. So I think there is a bit of that as well that can come into play, even in the case of China, where whether you acknowledge it or not as much, but I think the fact that you have a capable private sector that can contribute to the Chinese space growth story, I think that's something that would that could be an important rationale, that they could be part of the overall growth of the state space program, important enough for China to incentivize, therefore, private sector participation. Like I said, within Asia, industries have been part of the Japan space program, but changes now in China and India. There is notable support from the Chinese government for the new space industries in China. Firms like the Link Space and the Land Space and the iSpace have gained greater space within China to operate in a fairly efficient manner. This, of course, did not happen without the necessary intervention from the top leadership. In fact, since Xi Jinping came into office, there has been a focus on incorporating the private sector as an active partner in China's civil space program. In fact, a policy document was issued by the State Council in 2015 that highlighted the need for bringing in the private sector to contribute to areas such as the remote sensing data, the development, launch, and operation of commercial remote sensing satellites, as well as in the satellite-based navigation ground application system, and so on and so forth. So there has been enormous state intervention that's been done to create that space for private sector to take an more active role within China. There is also enormous support that China's new space companies get from the venture capital giants, again, for their space activities. And they are now part of the entire works, whether it is the launchers, satellite platforms. Again, the previous keynote speakers have given a lot more details about this. They are involved in launchers, satellite platforms, satellite subsystems, satellite services, ground segment, and so on and so forth. So I think they are. Okay, I need to slow down. Okay, that's I will do that. But as for the number of new space enterprises in China, like a lot of other things about China, information on these are fairly problematic. There is huge amount of there is the lack of information, the lack of transparency in that sense has continued to be an issue with regard to any sector, and so there are variations from having about 35 new space enterprises to which is being put out by Disrupt Space, to 60 to 80, or even some other estimates saying that there are about 100 new space enterprises. But these are all, I think, part of the problem is that you don't have a clear definition of how do you define a new space, or is it some of the traditional industries moving out to now space activities and so on and so forth. So because of that lack of understanding of what really constitutes definitional aspects of what really constitutes a new space or a private or a pure space industry and so on and so forth, there are these huge variations. But the fact is that I think this growth will, whether it is 35 or 80 or 100, this growth momentum within China is set to continue. And I believe this is also an effect of the Western private sector participation, who are also becoming more active in the global governance debates. They want to get a fair share of the pie when it comes to the debates on setting the rules of the road, whether in laying out some sort of standards, or the global, whether it is standards for lunar mining activities, or standards issuing certain guidelines. The lead is taken by the industry in some of these conversations. So looking at that Western context and how the private sector, the industry has taken an active role, I think countries like China certainly are learning from that experience. So it is also an effect of the Western context, how the private sector has had a bigger role and influence within the national context, but also in global governance debates. And therefore, that's, I would think, the growth of the private sector within China is a phenomena that will continue for the near future. Nevertheless, there are a couple of issues with regard to China's industries, including the new space ones. One is the first question is how autonomous they are. Not that they are completely state controlled, but there are state controls. There are state controls in very many ways. There are very strict state laws that have come up in recent years that apply to each of the industries. And even last year, sometime there were reports that talked about as to how President Xi Jinping wants even private sector to sort of be active partners in terms of collecting intelligence and information gathering and so on and so forth. So I think even though these might be purely independent autonomous entities in quote unquote, the state laws that apply to these industries are fairly stringent, and therefore there is a question of how autonomous, how independent are these entities in terms of their functioning, and so on and so forth. So that's one set of issues that comes into play. Second is the kind of activities that these industries engage in. To give you an example, this is not something that relates to the space sector, but companies like, for instance, Huawei in the larger telecommunication industry, Huawei and ZTE, for instance, their supposed collusion with the state and so on and so forth. The state influence within these companies in particular have been part of the conversations in global debates, for instance. So there are questions about the state, the independence of these companies, but also the kind of activities that they could engage in. And therefore, there is a certain amount of wariness about the new space enterprises coming up in China. Diversity of space applications are today so large that people are going to continue investing in these areas. Chinese space program and specifically the private sector could continue to see a significant increase, but their ability to stay as an independent actor like the Western companies, I think that will continue to be an issue, especially under the current leadership in China. There is really nothing very private about what these companies do. And in fact, just like I had a point very similar to what Blaine had said, there is not going to be a Jeff Bezos or an Elon Musk and precisely because of what I said, the independence and the kind of activities that they engage in, there is not going to be a Jeff Bezos that might come about within China. You also had earlier some question on the whole China's accelerated space collaboration with some of the Southeast Asian countries and how even India and as well as other countries, why China is engaged in this increased collaboration. I think to me, it looks like it's a mix of both economic and strategic rationale that is driving China to do what it is doing. And China's expansion of its space tentacles through its Belt and Road Initiative, the Space Silk Road, and again, Blaine talked about the Spatial Information Corridor, part of the BRI. All of that have strengthened, in a sense, the wariness of China's long-term plans. And China's BRI not only consists of ports and roads and railway networks, but also communication, Earth observation, post-PNT satellites, and so on and so forth, both for use by the Chinese government, citizens, companies, participating BRI countries, of course, along the entire geographical expanse, whether it is in Middle East or Central Asia or the entire Indo-Pacific region and so on and so forth. So there is certain amount of skepticism about the China's longer term plans and how some of the current activities that China is engaged in is also contributed to by the geopolitical conditioning than purely economic or scientific and technological collaboration. So that's just to sum up, I think sadly so, I think a lot of the geopolitical tensions on Earth will continue to influence our understanding and assessment of the growing Chinese space progress, including that of the new space and private sector in a sense. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Reggie. You never disappoint us. There are probably enough information in what you said for us to continue discussing for 3 hours. So now I would like to turn to Kazuto with roughly the same question. So from your perspective in Japan, How do you see Japanese stakeholders, so government, industry, approaching the rise of the Chinese commercial space sector? And I would add to this, because Raji already mentioned the question that I was planning to ask later about the Chinese initiatives in Southeast Asia. So if you can add a bit more on this, how it's seen from the perspective of Japan that has also similar kind of partnership with Southeast Asian countries.
Right. Well, first of all, I'm very happy to have this opportunity to host this this workshop at the University of Tokyo. This is my first appearance, perhaps, as a member of the as a professor of the Tokyo University. So, as Quentin mentioned, you know, I just moved last year, so I'm very glad to host this workshop, and I also congratulate Marco for compiling this very interesting report. I think this is a very unique attempt to identify the new space activities in Asia, which is very rare and which has not been focused in the sort of in the space community. Because people are focusing too much on what's happening in the United States and Europe, but I think there is definitely something going on and worthwhile to pay attention to. And also, I congratulate the Blaine for compiling such a wonderful data on the Chinese new space, which are very informative and very useful. Okay, the Japanese perspective on the new space in China is, I think most of the stakeholders in Japan pay too much attention on the Chinese public activities. You know, we pay too much attention on the CASIC or the CNSA or you know, all these manned space, you know, human space flights, the exploration in the other side of the moon. There are many sort of notable activities in China, and also we pay very heavy attention to this civil military fusion of Chinese attempts. I think Raji mentioned heavily on the navigation timing and navigation positioning and timing by Beidou, and these are sort of a strategic investment by China, and these are mainly the public and somewhat military investment. So the new space in China is not highlighted in Japan in the many discussions. But nevertheless, I think what's happening in China is very interesting. Of course, it's not the same. It's not taking the same path with United States or Japan, where there is much more freedom and the free market principle applied. But still, the amount of investment is phenomenal. And I think after United States, China is the second largest private, or the funding for the private activities in space. Although, as we discussed, you know, the previous discussion mentioned that it's not clear that what is private and what is public in China. But still, you know, I think there is a new space activities other than the government, central government oriented space activities. The amount of funding is phenomenal. But also, I think I'd like to mention about the huge pool of human resources. When you open and hold the academic conference on, for example, the satellite navigation, then you can easily gather like 5,000 people in one conference, and which is much bigger than any other country. If you do the sort of an academic conference in United States on the on any you know, GNSS type of meeting, then you can't really have this number. I think the people are there are so many researchers in the very various locations. It's very diversified source of research institutions in the universities and CASIC, CAIC, etc. And there are a large number of people are competing heavily on finding the new idea and submitting the papers and articles in the research journals. And I think this is boosting the capabilities of the Chinese new space. And I think as far as we see the launch company like iSpace or the Earth observation companies like Landspace, they do have a very high technological capabilities, and they do have a very fascinating product. Although I think what is interesting is that even though they do have a very high technical capabilities, it's not yet clear about where their market is, where do they target in the market. Internationally speaking, I mean, I think Blaine and Raj mentioned that Chinese new space is not heavily engaged in the international cooperation. And I would add to that, it is still under the very strict limitation of the access to the international market, because the United States still holds the regulation called the Wolf Amendment. The Wolf Amendment prohibits the US companies or any US products or any product which contains the US products more than 10% cannot be launched by the Chinese launchers. So I think it isolates the Chinese market from the international market, and I think the Wolf Amendment applies not only for the public space but also the new space. So I am not exactly sure where these new space companies, commercial space companies in China is targeting. And of course, they do have a very big domestic market, but still, the commercial companies are still subordinate to the public activities. So, is this it doesn't seem that the public space activities is outsourcing to the private activities. So that's another thing which puzzles me, where these new space is going, what are their business plans, and what they try to achieve is not extremely clear. And of course, the BRI and the Chinese expansion to Southeast Asia, as Quentin asked as a question, I think. But still, it's not clear that they are targeting the Southeast Asian country as a market. And it doesn't seem that the new space activities are expanding to the Southeast Asian companies. Of course, there are certain market presence in there, but I don't think that the Chinese new space companies are heavily involved and dominating in these markets. On the other hand, I think what is interesting from the Japanese point of view is that the Japanese startup companies are now actively accessing to the markets like Philippines or Myanmar or Malaysia. And there is a clear link, and academically, the academic link between universities, and also that leads to the more collaboration between the startup companies in Japan and the governments of the countries like Philippines, Malaysia, and Myanmar. So I think in this case, I think the Japanese companies have more advantages in penetrating in the Southeast Asian market, and again, it is still not clear where the Chinese new space targets as their major market. Also, on the other hand, the other side of the limitation of the Chinese new space is the limited access to the global supply chain. Not to mention as Huawei and the other semiconductor companies like SMIC or SMIC, that China is now facing a lot of problem for the accessing to the global supply for the high-tech products. And of course, China has its own capability of the autonomous production of the space material, and I think this is thanks to the isolation of the China from the international market. But I think this is another part that may hinder the approaches of the Chinese new space to the international market, and that is also associated with the issue of the civil-military fusion. I think that Xi Jinping has mentioned, I think Raji mentioned that Xi Jinping has promoted this idea of contributing the private companies contributing to the public intelligence gathering activities and the public strategic programs. But this civil-military fusion is also making the international market more cautious about collaborating with the Chinese new space market. So it may work negatively on their business model. So I am wondering what they are going to do with this sort of issue. So I think most of the startups cannot make their own businesses only in their countries. Even in the United States, the Starlinks and the Rocket Labs and etc. These startup companies are making the global, making business at the global market. But does China possibly do that? That's another question. And I think this is one of the reasons why they are focusing too much on the launcher market. The leading investment goes to the launcher market because they are looking for the Chinese public satellites to launch. And I think it is interesting that the Chinese launcher, the startup launcher market, is more targeting of the heavier satellites. It's not focusing on the smaller sat, like a Rocket Lab or PLD space in Spain. These Western small launchers are targeting on launching the sort of less than 200 kilo satellites, but the Chinese new space launchers are targeting like 500 kilos, etc. So there is a sort of a different strategy and different understanding of where the new space trying to make money out of it. And finally, I think the question, I think the Blaine and the Raji has already posed is how to collaborate or how to make a relationship with the public space activities. It is still not clear, whether this commercial space is the sort of a subordinate, or is it going to be the outsource of the public space activities, or is it the competitor of the public space activities? So it's not clear where these Chinese new space fits into this the entire Chinese space market and the global space market. So those are the sort of an interesting point to discuss, and I think it is. But still, it is a very interesting subject to focus, and I think we have a lot more to explore. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And yes, again, we could discuss hours. We have around 15 minutes left for this discussion. So now I would like to turn to Blaine. So based on what was just said by Kazuto and previously by Raji, what would you say is the extent to which the government support is to kind of develop the sector to support a domestic demand or kind of fight internationally with other existing space powers. And I make my question a bit more specific. When I say government, I suppose that the central government and the provincial governments have probably a very different rationale in their support to the industry.
Yeah, so just before getting into that very interesting question, just one comment on
Sure.
Kazuto-san's discussion. When you mentioned the way that Japan focuses primarily on the big civil programs and not really so much on the new space, it reminded me a lot as an American of the way that the US looks at China. You know, we have a very similar way. And I think part of the reason probably for the US is that American commercial companies, they don't have any plans to do any business in China with any of the commercial companies. And so why look at 100 different commercial companies? And I guess the question maybe worth thinking about a little bit more maybe is, you know, is Japan similar, you know, is Japan the same as the US in that way, where there's essentially zero opportunity for this kind of business in China? And maybe the answer is yes, but if the answer is no, then it sounds like maybe Japanese startups could be looking a little bit more at the commercial part of the sector. But anyway, that was interesting. Just as an American, reminded me of my home country's look at China. So now to Quentin's question. So first, I think it's I would say that most of the central government's support for commercial space, most of what they would like commercial space to do, I think, is to develop technologies for domestic use, whether that would mean for the domestic market, in like, you know, commercial launch companies selling a launch to a commercial satellite manufacturer, or I think probably more importantly, I think the central government views commercial space companies as a way of having somewhat more nimble innovation with very specific technologies. So for example, at the moment, there is no state-owned launch company that can build a liquid methalox rocket, and there are companies trying to develop this, but it, you know, it's not easy to do. And I suppose the government may look at the incentive structure and just the way that the state-owned companies are kind of set up and say, maybe this is not the best environment for this kind of rapid innovation or for doing, you know, very cutting-edge things. And I think that by having these commercial companies that remain, to Raji's point, you know, not so autonomous in some ways, it's a way for the government to basically have different ways of innovating, because you have the very kind of structured way of the SOEs, and then you have this more kind of free-moving way of the commercial companies, while also not giving up control, because again, the government is they like to have control. And so I think that in general, that would be the main motivation. That being said, I do think that the central government, and really, I think President Xi Jinping, are very economically pragmatic. You know, they don't, I don't think that, I say this and it's a little bit speculative, but I don't think that Xi Jinping is a very big fan of space. If he retires, I don't think he will buy a telescope to put in his backyard just to spend time, like Hu Jintao does, the previous president. And so from that perspective, I do think any space activity in China, there must either be kind of a soft power goal, maybe, or an economic goal. And I do think, you know, being economic pragmatists, and also to a certain extent being kind of geopolitical pragmatists, I don't think there's a lot of just sort of doing space just for the sake of it. And so I think then if you consider that, there would certainly be some expectation that in the, say, medium to long term, there would be an export element to this, because again, it's sort of economic development, and it's, you know, that's how you make money on these things, I suppose. And so, yeah, I think it's both, but I think in the short term to medium term, it is more about developing technologies domestically in a way that is maybe different from the SOEs. And I think that might also relate a little bit to what we heard earlier about China being cut off from the global supply chain. So there's a lot of different, very niche, but also very specific technologies that China needs to develop domestically. And so again, I think to have these different ways of innovating is just, it's sort of diversification, if nothing else.
Thank you very much. So for the last 10 minutes, I want to focus on two very nice questions we had in the Q&A box. One question for Marco, Raji, and Kazuto in this order, and I will ask you for short answers so we can make it. From Jacqueline Meir. Do you think commercial companies in your countries are interested in cooperating with the commercial space sectors in China? If yes, what would be the incentive for those companies in Europe, India, and Japan to do so? So very tough question. Marco, you're the one to start.
So it is indeed a tough question, this one. So there are no real incentive in cooperating actually within the European landscape. There may be opportunities of engagement. However, at the moment, the engagement that we foresee with China is that we would basically like to sit, not only with China, but including with China, to understand what are the rules of the game we want to apply to commercial markets. Because we see a lot of disruption, potential disruption coming from China. And as you know, European space industry is highly reliant on commercial market, unlike the US space industry, unlike the Japanese space industry, which are basically focused on the domestic demand. Our industry, to sustain itself, needs to rely on commercial markets. And we see, you know, this sort of Chinese penetration, it may not come from state-owned new space, but from CASC and China Great Wall Industry Corporation, you know, but those so-called packages basically are a source of concerns for European space industry. So I would say the engagement we would like to have, and in this sense, I would recall the EU Council resolution that we approved last year about establishing key principles for the global space economy, is about sitting together with important partners to define what kind of rules we want to apply to commercial markets. Since commercial markets are going to become even more important in the future, I think there is this sort of I would say basis or necessity to sit together. Achieving this is a completely different matter. It will be tough, of course, but it's worth a try. From an industrial perspective, I think the incentives are a bit less, as they're focused exclusively on competition, especially with the Chinese. There may be, I would say, more engagement opportunities with Indian startups or with Japanese startups, in a sense. With the Chinese, there may be, I would say, the engagement would and will continue to be primarily at state level, in a sense, at G2G rather than B2B. I don't know.
No, it's excellent answer. Raji, your turn. Is it realistic to imagine Indian and Chinese space companies working together?
So I think things have been getting pretty difficult between India and China for the last several years. Even in 2017, India and China had a standoff for about 72 days in Doklam, which is a tri-junction between India, China, and Bhutan. That we managed to resolve without any going into a full-fledged conflict. But last summer, 2020, we broke several records. There was casualty for the first time in several decades. There was fighting on the border after several decades. So, and the things that peace and tranquility that was held by both, that was nurtured by both the political leadership of both countries, managed to break away in the last summer. Several agreements that held that peace and tranquility were not observed by China, at least. So I think things have been increasingly getting more difficult. There has always been a trust deficit, but I think after summer of 2020, it has gotten far worse. So if you think, and in the post, for instance, this was a place in Galvan where this casualty happened and the conflict happened. There has been a disengagement, but the trust deficit on the Indian side, and I'm sure on the Chinese side as well, is pretty serious, significant. And I don't think, since the Galvan incident, there have been a number of contracts with the Chinese companies that have been closed, shut down, and so on and so forth. Whether they're planned to engage in a road project, so on and so forth. Many projects have been shut off in the last 1 year. Is there a prospect for space companies to work, and space is immune from the geopolitics of the day? I don't think so. And I think it's going to be extremely difficult. If you ask some of the new space industries in India, maybe they have a little bit of a hope because they do see their counterparts having a flourishing industry there, having a lot of money coming in from their venture capitals, big giants in a sense. But take away that the new space sector, but talk to the larger sector, larger population, or larger political or other security folks, and I don't think you will see a lot of enthusiasm about doing anything with China. Over the last year, there have been several surveys done in terms of what is the kind of perception towards China and so on and so forth. It's one of hostility, and that the suspicion about China has only grown so much more, manyfold over the last year in particular. So the opportunity for any sort of collaboration between India and China, and China for the longest time never wanted to look at India in the space sector at all, till India actually did the Mars mission in 2014. China never even looked at India as a serious space power at all. But since the Mars mission happened in 2014, China has tried to reach out to India to say that maybe we should talk about space collaboration and so on and so forth. But under current geopolitical circumstances, I do see very little possibility of the two space communities coming together, whether it is private or the space state agencies.
Thank you very much. And now we'll turn to Kazuto. If I may make this joke, can we imagine the Chinese iSpace company sending an asset from the Japanese iSpace company in the future?
I don't think the Chinese iSpace is capable of reaching I think it's going to be like a 4 kilo, but still, yeah, I don't think the Chinese iSpace launcher is capable of reaching to the moon. But nevertheless, I think there's the Japanese startups' point of view. They do have a fascination of the Chinese technology, and there is a very I think they want to see the possibility of if it's possible, then to make a collaboration. And I think this is from a purely technical perspective, but from the regulatory side, I think it is extremely difficult to overcome the ITAR issues and the Japanese export control and the Chinese investment and the using Chinese parts and components in the Japanese assets and Japanese spacecraft. I think regulatory-wise, it's extremely difficult to overcome this sort of a control, and also I think there is very limited opportunities for the business-wise to penetrate to the Chinese market, as I think Blaine mentioned that the Chinese startups are mainly focusing on the Chinese market, and I think there are very limited opportunity for the Japanese new space or even the old space to go into the Chinese market to get to make some business. So I think it is more of a risk if they do so than the opportunity. So I think there is a very limited incentive for the Japanese companies to collaborate with Chinese startups or penetrate into the Chinese market.
Thank you very much. We will have to wrap up, but there is one last question that is quite interesting for Blaine. And Blaine, you will have the honor of concluding answering this question and adding any bit of information you want based on what was said. So question from Naoko Sugita from JAXA. So she explains that she heard that recently the Chinese government amended the law to allow private investment to be used for dual-use technologies as well. Is this correct? And if so, is this part of the alignment of government and private policies?
Quentin, can I just take a 1 minute to just add something here?
Okay, yes, please. And then
so
Blaine can
Kazuda absolutely spoke about rightly about the civil military fusion, and some of the things that make difficulties for Chinese enterprises to work with Indian or maybe even Japanese companies or things are, one is civil military fusion that is happening in a big way as part of the Chinese military modernization. Second is the peacetime wartime integration that is also speeding up in terms of the capability development and institutional setups. Third is the cross-domain fusion. So space, cyber, electromagnetic, all of them coming together, especially with the setting up establishment of the PLA Strategic Support Force in 2015. Since then, all of these aspects have gained greater salience as part of the Chinese longer-term strategy. So in a sense, these aspects make the cooperation much more restricted in terms of how openly India or other countries, some of the Indo-Pacific countries, would want to partner with China. Sorry, thank you.
Oh, excellent point. So now Blaine.
Yeah, so thank you for the question, and also thank you, Raji, for the information there as well. So I don't know of the specific policy change that you're referring to, Naoko-san. I can look into that a little bit and follow up with you thereafter. But just to add a little bit, perhaps, on the military-civil fusion element. So this is certainly something that is a significant part of the Chinese space sector, to the extent that it is a very high-level governmental policy, similar to the ones that I mentioned before. And that means that there's a lot of support for it at many different levels. So just to give an example, I was visiting a commercial satellite manufacturer in Beijing about 18 months ago, and their office was located in a Chinese Academy of Sciences military civil fusion kind of industrial park type of thing. And to Raji's point a moment ago, this sort of industrial park it involved this sort of cross-disciplinary or sort of multiple industry kind of element, where it is a industrial park that is focused on military civil fusion, and there may be some commercial space companies, and there may be some AI companies, and there may be some other companies in some other sort of cutting edge technologies. And probably they are all getting subsidized rent and maybe some other support in this government industrial park. And I think certainly to the points that were just mentioned, that would complicate collaboration with a lot of different countries. That being said, I do think that it's important to note that there's a lot of countries that buy their military hardware from China, like Pakistan probably is a very, or Venezuela, and so to the extent that China seems to be developing this sort of comprehensive suite of technologies and services and high-tech products that have dual use capabilities, it is certainly a hindrance for some countries to collaborate, but it also I think makes China a more kind of one-stop shop, if we can call it that, or kind of a turnkey solution for the countries that are trying to that are kind of on the Chinese side of the world sort of political divide, if we can call it that. So yeah, I think it's certainly a very interesting topic, and again, I will follow up later with if I can find any more information on that.
Thank you very much to all the panelists. I really want to organize another event to continue this discussion because we could discuss more and more hours. So just before giving the floor to Professor Shiroyama for the short closing remarks, I would like to invite all the audience to remotely upload all our panelists. It was truly interesting, truly great. And of course, for everyone, if you want more detail, there is the SP report with a lot of detail, not only on China, but on South Korea, India, Thailand, Malaysia, Japan. So check out the report. Also check out the publications of Raji and Kazuto that deal with many of these issues. So again, dear panelists, thank you very much. It was really an honor to have you for this session. So now we'll hand over to Professor Shiroyama for the closing remarks.
Yeah, thank you very much for the very active input and discussion, and also the question from the floor. As I Quentin mentioned, that this is a very interesting and timely topic, and we think that we'd like to have another opportunity to continue today's discussion. Anyway, thank you very much for your active participation, and looking forward to another opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shiroyama Sensei. And the final announcement before we finish is that the video will be uploaded on YouTube very soon. So you can check again what was discussed, the information. There are a lot of information to process. So I think it will be nice for everyone to check it once or twice more. So thank you again to all the participants. Stay tuned for future international workshops of the STIG program on space issues, but also on the various other issues dealt with at the STIG program. And have a wonderful day for people in Europe and a wonderful evening for those in Asia. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Arigatou gozaimasu.
Thank you.